Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Maybe I'll be there to shake your hand. Maybe I'll be there to share the land that be given away when we all live
Well,
together.
land, it's the ultimate story of supply and demand. There's only so much of it, and there are so many of us. There are wars right now being fought over it. In any given American city, it's likely that there are high-paid lawyers in court right now fighting over development rights to build a luxury development. Centuries ago, European settlers displaced Native Americans from it.
Yeah, underlying everything humans have done on land in the modern era is one question: who does land belong to? And other questions arise when thinking about that, like who should it belong to, and how has the commodification of land led to inequality and environmental crises?
Those are some of the questions that Audrea Lim considers in her new book. It's out today. Audrea, an environmental journalist and author. Her new book is called Free the Land: How We Can Fight Poverty and Climate Chaos. Welcome to the program. Appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Congratulations on the book. In your introduction, you write that you first started thinking about land about a decade ago. You were on a reporting trip to the Canadian tar sands. Take us back there in your thought process and the evolution of this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. About 10 years ago, I was reporting on the climate crisis and the social movements that were coalescing around it. And if you think back to that time, the climate discourse was really focused on like science data at the time, fossil fuel consumption, carbon emissions, global temperature rise. But I started going up to the Canadian tar sands, which are these like vast oil mines in Canada, not far from where I grew up in Calgary. And the Indigenous water protector movements who were like really gaining prominence around that time, in their fights against oil pipelines like the Keystone XL pipeline, they were talking about their opposition to these developments and their engagement with the climate movement, really, in terms of land. So the land was stolen from them. They still had rights, treaty rights, over these lands that oil developments were now violating. These oil developments were being driven by fossil fuel corporations and governments that own the land, but were seeking oil revenues and oil royalty profits, really, from the land. So I was living in Brooklyn at the time. I still live here now. And the anti-gentrification movement was like really popping off here. So the loudest part of that narrative that I think everybody knows at the time was that gentrification is, white people moving into Black and brown neighborhoods and bringing in their, $25 artisanal cocktails and their pretentious matcha oat milk lattes or whatever. But just around this movement, I was also hearing activists telling a slightly different, like much more complex story about what was happening, what gentrification was to them. So what it was that, you have longtime residents are being evicted or priced out of their apartments. And this is a process that they have basically no control over. It just means, you basically one day receive an eviction notice or a rent increase notice in the mail, and that's kind of it. You take it or, you move out. And also on top of that, a lot of these communities that had been in these neighborhoods a long time, they were saying that they were being ignored when they raised concerns over, new luxury developments that were being proposed just down the street. And so basically what I was hearing is that these communities were saying they had no control over the lands they had lived on for decades or longer in many cases. Gentrification and indigenous dispossession are not the same thing, but they share one thing that's very similar. Both processes are about how people are deprived of ownership and control over the lands that they live on and depend upon. So I realized that issues over land, like who controls it, profits from it, who benefits from it, who uses it, who decides how to use it. These were like at the center of some of the just biggest social issues that we face today, like racial injustice, inequality, the housing crisis, food, climate, and the environmental crisis.
That's why I want to ask you, that's right, because you make this connection, your work as a writer and journalist and your book on land, energy, and the environment. Why is it then, so take the next step, and I'm thinking to our audience who are listening, that why it is so important to understand the land ownership system and how it's developed over centuries and the implications of such. Because what in your belief has land ownership resulted in?
Yeah. So I think when a lot of people think about land, they just think of rural places like pastures, mountains, forests, maybe farms. But really it grounds quite literally everything in our cities, just in our world, even seaports, spaceports, the computer server farms that house our digital avatars. So it's actually a very big component of everything, how we the finances of how anything gets built. Land, land gets rolled up in the real estate package along with buildings, but we just don't really talk about land itself that much. Now, what I started to realize is that, America treats land above all as a commodity to be bought or sold and used as collateral for a loan. And, land ownership or home ownership now is it's such a central component of the American dream, where this idea that we work hard, we save our money, and our big achievement is becoming a homeowner. And regular Americans, we rely on home ownership or, in the past, land ownership as a way of achieving stability into retirement and to, build assets and family wealth that can be passed on to children. It's one of the most important sources of generational wealth in America. And, its promise of stability and wealth, these things that it's supposed to provide, is especially important in America, where our social safety net is really dwindling. So the problem is that the free market in land also allows speculators and investors to buy it purely as a financial instrument. And when its value, the value of land, when it grows, which it usually does, ownership, the price of ownership and rents just rise further out of reach for the average person. And this also applies to, it's a huge factor for any kind of business, you see this in my neighborhood for small businesses. It's so hard for these little restaurants and shops and coffee shops and whatever to just stay afloat because rents are just surging.
Exactly. Hey, we only have about a minute left, and then we're going to do some news and come back for more with you. But before we do that, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your experience as a child in nature and how that shaped your view of land. Just for 1 minute, and then we'll come back with more.
Yeah. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and I grew up in a place in a suburb that was really, really well kept and close to provincial parks. And I just had a really nice childhood with really well-funded public infrastructure. And I realized at one point that, a lot of this is financed by the tar sands that I mentioned earlier, the oil developments. I also spent a lot of time in the sort of Rocky Mountain national parks and provincial parks of Alberta, Canada, which are also beautiful and well kept, and the highways and, infrastructure leading to it also, partially financed and in some cases sponsored by these oil corporations. So I had this amazing experience as a child, hiking in the mountains and skiing, snowboarding. And I got to experience it as this beautiful place of wilderness. But at the same time, those experiences are also just financed by industry. And that applies in places all around America, places where the economy is dominated by timber, say,
right,
or whatever other industry. Yeah.
No, right. It's the conflict that we have to deal with. We want to get back to our guest. We're talking with Audrea Lim. She is an environmental journalist and author. She has a new book out. It's called Free the Land: How We Can Fight Poverty and Climate Chaos. And she's been just really laying out for us in the previous segment kind of historically land ownership, the system that we've had for centuries in terms of ownership. Having said that, I do wonder, Audrea, what would the world look like if we had more publicly owned land? Like what's that system look like, or where do you think we need to be, and how do you think it would be a better system?
Yeah. So I think when people think what is the opposite or the alternative, the main alternative to private ownership is public ownership. And to some degree, that is true. Public ownership is the other model of land ownership that we have, that everybody knows about, that, you know, is like symbolized by the national parks and federal lands and things like that. But there's actually a whole spectrum of different kind of solutions and different just solutions to the problems of commodification and people's lack of control over land. And a lot of my book actually focuses on a lot of these solutions that are out there and that a lot of people in communities are already putting into practice. And, you know, modeling, experimenting with, and using in different ways. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what the range of these, there's some that sound very uninspiring, but they're really important. So the two problems we have, of course, are commodification. And so there's solutions that help to decommodify land, which means shielding parcels from the pressures of the real estate market. And then there's ones that tackle the problem of control, which means that they sort of democratize control over land beyond just like a single owner. So if we look around in our cities, when it comes to housing, rent regulations and rent controls, these are laws that, you know, put limits on how much landlords can raise the rent on tenants. Sounds kind of boring or uninspiring, but they're really, really important for keeping prices reasonable for tenants and keeping tenants in their homes. We have public housing, which is probably the most prominent model of, you know, heavily decommodified housing in America. This is government owned, public owned, and rents are really substantially below market rate. The problem with public housing in America is that it's really, really heavily stigmatized, and it's become very racialized. It's largely, at least today, mostly, you know, poor Black and brown residents that live in it. And these residents also don't have very little control over their surroundings in these public housing projects. You know, they're heavily policed. So it doesn't deal with the problem of control. My book focuses a lot on this model called community land trust. And I do this because it's sort of a middle ground, I guess, between public and private. And because most people, I think, don't know about it very much. And yet it's like, this model is really exploding in popularity, I think, because of the affordability crisis right now in both farmland and housing. So what this model is basically the land itself is owned and controlled by a community. And so you have like a nonprofit, essentially, that owns the land. But this nonprofit organization is directed, the board of directors, you know, is a rotating cast of community residents, local businesses, organizations, maybe even politicians who have like a stake, or I mean, just city officials who have a stake in the neighborhood, in the community. But any homes or buildings that are on top of the land can be privately owned, inherited, or sold, so that, you know, individual residents or businesses, entrepreneurs can still accrue assets and build wealth. And so this land can actually be used for like anything: housing, commercial space, cultural centers.
I want to make sure we only have 3 minutes left, so I want to make sure we talk a little bit about zoning, because zoning is something that is such a contentious issue in so many communities around the country, so-called NIMBYs, who don't want to see upzoning and more density in areas. How do people look at zoning?
Sorry, it cut out for just like a second there. I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, it's okay. Zoning is so contentious, zoning laws, and the idea of upzoning and creating more density in areas of the United States. It's so contentious. How do you view it?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so zoning is basically, these are laws that determine how land can be used. So the way that I think it's really, really, really important is that, you know, politicians, and we often suggest that the solution to this affordability crisis, affordable housing crisis right now, is just that we need to build more housing and increase the supply, right? And, in cities where land is really cheap and abundant, developers really just need like material and workers to build, and any demand for more housing can really easily just prompt more construction, right? But in a city, I'm in New York City, right? Land is very, very expensive, and undeveloped parcels are just like very few and far between. There's very little undeveloped land here. So speculators or investors, developers, will only invest in land if they can get more rent or value from a property by like renovating, rebuilding, evicting tenants, longtime tenants, and then building something more lucrative. So this in New York City usually requires changes to zoning or land use rules in places that don't have zoning. These rules that they need changes called upzoning, which allow developers to build something bigger or to build residential and office space where, say, like manufacturing or open space were only allowed. And sorry?
No, we unfortunately are kind of running out of time, and I feel like we're going to have to continue this conversation at another time. We know it's complicated. It's interesting because I am curious about, is there a combination ultimately of community land trusts more so along with kind of private ownership, because it's hard to imagine the model changing completely. But you've given us a lot to think about, and hopefully we can continue this conversation at another time. Audrea Lim, she is environmental journalist and author. We really appreciate her time. Visiting scholar at the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, joining us from Brooklyn. And her new book is Free the Land, How We Can Fight Poverty and Climate Chaos. I feel like we've been talking a lot about capitalism, land ownership, a lot of things, and why we're at kind of such a difficult time in this country right now.
And as an asset class, it's even come up today in our conversations today at Bloomberg Invest.